You're holding something on fire. It's late. The room smells like cedar and ash. Outside, somewhere in Edo, a city of 1 million people is going about its evening. But in here, in this quiet moment, someone has just done something that will feel completely familiar to you and completely strange at the same time. They've put a tiny pipe to their lips, breathed in, and held the smoke. Now here's the thing. You've probably assumed that smoking in Japan is basically the same story as everywhere else. Tobacco shows up, people like it, moving on. But the actual history of what Japanese people smoked, what they were really after, and what they thought it was doing to them, is one of the stranger rabbit holes in the whole of Japanese social history. Because it wasn't just tobacco, and the people who first adopted the habit weren't who you think. And the government's response to it? The government's response was both completely predictable and absolutely insane. Here's what actually happened. Let's start with what most people assume. Tobacco arrived in Japan. Everyone started smoking. The end. That's the story in about 4 sentences in every general history of Japan ever written. Here's what that story leaves out. First, Japan didn't just receive tobacco passively. When Portuguese traders brought it to Kyushu around 1543, the Japanese didn't just shrug and reach for a pipe. They looked at it, studied it, argued about it, banned it 3 times, and still couldn't stop it spreading. Within 60 years of first contact, tobacco was everywhere. One contemporary account described it moving through the country faster than any trade good in living memory. That is not a passive adoption. Second, the idea that smoking in Japan was always primarily recreational is wrong. The earliest Japanese records describe tobacco as a medicine first, a social ritual second, and a pleasure third. The recreational cigarette is a modern European re-import. The original Japanese relationship with smoke was far more intentional than that. Third, and this is the part nobody mentions, tobacco was not the only thing people were smoking. Japan had a pre-existing relationship with cannabis that stretches back thousands of years before any Portuguese ship arrived, and the line between what was medicinal, what was ceremonial, and what was recreational was considerably blurrier than the official histories suggest. So if the story isn't tobacco arrived and people smoked it, what is the actual story? It starts about 2,000 years before the first pipe was lit. Cannabis in Japan has a history so old it predates the country itself. Archaeologists have found hemp fiber in Jomon-period sites dating back to around 10,000 BCE, making Japan one of the earliest cultures on Earth with documented cannabis cultivation. Historian Shinichi Nishiyama, in his 2001 survey of plant use in ancient Japan, documented cannabis cultivation sites spanning virtually every major Jomon settlement excavated in the 20th century. This was not marginal. This was central. But here's the thing, and this is the reframe that changes everything. The ancient Japanese were not growing it to smoke it. They were growing it to wear it. Hemp was the primary textile fiber of the archipelago for millennia. The leaves and seeds were used in food. The stalks were twisted into rope. Cannabis was a resource plant first, and everything else came later. When did that shift happen? Gradually, and alongside Shinto ritual. The oldest Japanese ceremonial texts describe hemp rope used in shrine purification rituals, hemp seeds burned as offerings, and the smoke from burning cannabis considered a way of communicating with spirits. Anthropologist Gary Loop, in his 2003 study of intoxicants in pre-modern Japan, noted that the ritual burning of hemp in Shinto contexts is documented from at least the Nara period, around 700 CE, and almost certainly predates written records entirely. So by the time tobacco arrived in the 16th century, Japan already had a framework for thinking about smoke. Smoke meant ritual. Smoke meant medicine. Smoke was something you used deliberately, not casually, which meant tobacco didn't arrive into a smoking vacuum. It arrived into a culture that had already been having a nuanced, complex, centuries-long conversation about what inhaling something meant. And that changes the story of tobacco's adoption completely. A minor historical comedy footnote here. The Portuguese, who introduced tobacco to Japan, were themselves only familiar with it because Spanish sailors had brought it from the Americas. A plant from the forests of the Caribbean ended up at the center of Edo-period Japanese social culture through a chain of accidents, shipwrecks, and mercantile ambition that nobody planned. History is mostly just chaos in fancy clothes. The Tokugawa shogunate banned tobacco 3 times. Each ban was issued with increasing severity. The 1616 edict threatened confiscation of property and, in some cases, execution. Historian Mary Elizabeth Berry, in her landmark 2006 study, Japan in Print, documented that by 1620, 4 years after the most severe ban, tobacco was being openly sold in Edo's licensed market districts. The bans failed for the same reason prohibition almost always fails. The thing being banned was already socially embedded before the government noticed. And tobacco embedded itself in Japan with extraordinary speed, specifically because of that pre-existing cultural framework around smoke. When a samurai merchant offered a traveler a smoke from his pipe, it wasn't just a nicotine transaction. It was a ritual of hospitality so quickly established that refusing it was considered rude within a generation of tobacco's arrival. By 1640, the shared pipe, kiseru, had its own etiquette, its own aesthetics, its own vocabulary. You couldn't ban that. You could only ban the plant. The shogunate eventually gave up and started taxing it instead. Honestly, respect. The pipe itself became the story. The kiseru, the thin, elegant Japanese tobacco pipe, was not just a smoking implement. It was a status object, a fashion statement, and a social signal so loaded that entire social hierarchies could be read in the length of a man's pipe stem. Long stems meant wealth. The longer the pipe, the less you needed to lean forward to smoke it, and the more servants you presumably had to load it for you. Peasants smoked short pipes. Samurai smoked medium pipes. The truly wealthy smoked pipes so long they needed assistance. This is the part of Japanese smoking history that gets left out of general accounts. It created one of the most visible class hierarchies of the Edo period, not through clothing or housing, but through a daily object that everyone from every class was now using. Everyone smoked. Not everyone smoked correctly. And what correctly meant was entirely determined by your social position. Female smokers complicated this further. Women in the pleasure districts adopted smoking early and developed their own kiseru aesthetics, sometimes more elaborate than men's, and the visual of a geisha with a long, lacquered pipe became one of the iconic images of Edo Japan. That image was simultaneously a status marker and a coded signal. The pipe said, "I have leisure, I have style, I have time." Here is the dark detail. In 1948, under American occupation, Japan passed the Cannabis Control Law, criminalizing a plant that had been part of Japanese agriculture and religious practice for at least 12,000 years. The documented reason given was alignment with American drug policy. But historian W. David Marks, in his 2023 Cultural History, Amatora, documented something more specifically revealing about how the occupation handled Japanese intoxicant culture. The Americans were not particularly concerned with the ritual or agricultural uses of cannabis. What they were concerned with was making Japan's legal framework legible to American legal standards. 12,000 years of hemp cultivation, textiles, food, shrine rope, ritual smoke, was made illegal in 18 months of administrative decision-making by people who had been in the country for 3 years. The thing that makes this historically jarring is not the ban itself, it's what was lost. Shinto shrines that had used hemp rope and purification rituals for over a millennium suddenly had to source alternatives. The specific varieties of cannabis cultivated in Japan over thousands of years for fiber quality, not psychoactive potency, were not distinguished from recreational varieties in the law. They were simply banned. Ancient agricultural knowledge, accumulated over generations, disappeared within a decade because the distinction between cannabis sativa grown for hemp and cannabis sativa grown for other purposes was not something the 1948 law cared to make. This is what happens when modern legal categories get applied to ancient practices. The ancient practice doesn't fit the category. The law doesn't bend. The practice disappears. So let's ask the question the right way. When ancient Japanese people smoked, from the Nara period through the Edo period, what were they actually after? The honest answer is several different things, and they knew the difference. Cannabis smoke in Shinto ritual was not recreational. The effect was a secondary consideration. The primary function was aromatic. The smell, the rising smoke, the transformation of a physical substance into something that moved between worlds. Ritual smoke in Japanese spiritual practice was communication, not intoxication. Tobacco, by contrast, arrived as a social tool. It was adopted because it created a shared ritual, the passed pipe, the moment of stillness, that mapped perfectly onto existing Japanese ideas about hospitality and presence. The distinction matters because it reframes the whole story. Japan didn't start smoking because it discovered a pleasurable habit. Japan started smoking because it already had a sophisticated philosophy of smoke, and tobacco just arrived at the right moment to slot into it. Before we go any further, I want to know what you think. Did the Tokugawa shogunate make the right call trying to ban tobacco? Or was the ban always doomed to fail? You can make a case either way. Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more ancient Japan stories that nobody else is telling, subscribe now. It's free. So, when did ancient Japanese people start smoking? The honest answer depends entirely on what you mean by smoke. If you mean cannabis in a ritual context, at least 1,700 years ago, probably earlier. If you mean tobacco as a social habit, around 1600, within 60 years of Portuguese contact. If you mean recreational smoking purely for pleasure, stripped of ritual significance, that's a considerably more modern invention than most people realize, and it's partly a Western re-export. Here is the etymology move. The Japanese word for tobacco is tabaco, borrowed directly from the Portuguese tabaco, which itself came from the Caribbean Taino word for the Y-shaped pipe used to inhale it. The plant named the instrument named the practice, and the practice arrived in Japan already carrying a foreign word because the Japanese didn't have one yet. That foreign word is still in daily use 400 years later. Every time someone in Japan buys a packet of cigarettes, they're using a word that traces back to a Taino farmer in the Caribbean who had never heard of Japan. Language carries history in ways that official records don't. And here is the personal relief reframe. If you've ever noticed that smoking, or any ritual you do that involves a moment of deliberate pause, something in your hands, a brief separation from whatever was just happening, feels like more than just a habit, you're picking up on something real. The reason shared rituals around consumption feel deeply social isn't modern. It's not about the substance. It is about what human beings have always done with shared moments of stillness. A samurai in 1620 passing a kiseru to a stranger at a roadside inn would have understood exactly what you understand when you step outside with a colleague for 5 minutes. The specific substance changes. The human thing underneath it doesn't. So, next time you smell smoke, wherever it's coming from, remember what that smell meant to someone standing in a Shinto shrine in 700 CE. Not a habit, not a vice, a signal. Something crossing between here and somewhere else. The government tried to ban it 3 times. The market ignored them. The shrines kept burning hemp rope. The geisha kept their long pipes. The merchants loaded their kiseru and passed them across the counter. And the practice survived every ban, every occupation, every reframing of what it was supposed to mean. Because the human instinct underneath it was never really about the plant.